Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Kurt Thompson.
And my friend, Pepper Sweetie.
We are here to discover and explore what it is to be truly known. Hey, Kurt.
Hey, Pep.
Hey, Kurt. I'm wondering if you know what color you're wearing today.
Oh, my gosh. Dude, you know I have a color deficiency.
Color deficiency, yes.
And
I'm just curious. It's just a test. I'm just wondering.
I'm guessing I'm wearing a red mock turtleneck and a blue sweater.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yep. You're guessing correctly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen like videos of people that like can't see color, and then they give
colorblind?
Yes, like totally color, like the world, and they give them glasses where they can see color. And just how their minds are just blown. I mean, they're just like, what the, right? So cool. So cool. Yeah.
It reminds me of the videos of children who are born with incomplete or complete hearing loss.
Yes.
And then for some reason that is surgically correctable.
Yep.
And they put headphones on them.
Yep.
And
like the first time they hear their mother's voice or their
oh my gosh,
just like wow.
Yeah.
Well, we are here in a season where we are talking all about rupture and repair, and so far we have we talked about benign ruptures, and then last week, if you were here, we talked about limit-setting ruptures, and today we're turning a little bit deeper, and we're going into toxic ruptures. It's important to talk about, and we're here for it.
Yeah. We kind of walk into our topic today with a bit of fear and trembling, because in some respects, you hear that phrase "toxic ruptures," and It is really the nature of what we're talking about. Anytime we're talking about some kind of rupture, no matter how small or how large, that feels insurmountable. Some kind of a rupture that feels unrepairable. And it's easy for us at first to imagine that when we use that word toxic rupture, that we're really talking about something major, something it has to be cataclysmic. We're going to war, or we're talking about a divorce, or we're talking about a significant betrayal, or somebody loses their temper in rage at someone. I mean, and those things are truly examples of that. But we're going to find as we talk over our time today that toxicity has ways of making its way into our lives in very, very small moments because of the nature of how the mind works. Typically, we find ourselves, when we think about toxic ruptures, we're imagining overwhelming or intensely painful mental states. So as we said, somebody's screaming at somebody or calling somebody names, or we're in a relationship in which you have a disagreement and then somebody just withdraws into silence and they just won't talk to you. I remember having a patient whose life growing up as a child was such that if she crossed her mother, and of course she would never know how badly was it that she had crossed her, but if she crossed her mother to some degree, her mother wouldn't talk to her for 2 weeks. And she's like a young, like an 8-year-old, and her mom won't talk to her for 2 weeks. That's like relational, like literal suffocation. And so that's one way when these things happen to us in toxic ways. And our listeners, many of you will, in your own life experience, things are already right now coming to mind about what we're talking about. We've had our own version of what feels like some toxic rupture that feels overwhelming. It feels catastrophic. But sometimes we're not always aware that when things happen to us, we also become part of the rupturing mechanism when we, for instance, we nurture a hurt or a wound. Something has happened to me, and then I just ruminate about it. And the longer I ruminate, the more I am persuaded that the rupture has happened to me, and the intensity with which I feel the rupture or the toxicity is really about the event that took place, without always being aware that I'm actually collaborating with it now. That I am now part of the rupture by virtue of how I'm telling the story about it. And, we've talked on this podcast before about the list of people that I keep a list of people that I have to forgive.
Yeah.
And these are people who I have either consciously or not consciously basically been holding a grudge against.
Sure.
And in that sense, there was a rupture at some point in time, and it continues to be easy for me to name the offending party as it's all about what they did.
Yeah.
Without me recognizing or owning that actually I am now participating in the rupture
internally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I think about, a story about a particular teacher I had, years and years ago. And he and that incident should not have any space in my head anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And every once in a while it comes up, and it's because of the story that I've told myself over the years over and over again.
Yeah.
And given it credence and given it, fanned the flame a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we can see how, of course, we're going to get to what makes a toxic rupture a toxic rupture. We can see how these things can be the result of cataclysmic events or wildly belligerent behavior, but they can also be things that grow out of minor events that become major catastrophes. I think about the story of a person that I had treated who he and she were driving. They themselves, he and his wife, were driving to a dinner date, and they passed a restaurant where he had his first encounter with a woman with whom he'd had an affair in the distant past. And he and his wife had come back from that affair, had worked through a lot of things in that affair. But there were some things that were kind of just going on in their house at the time, and something happened in that moment. And it didn't get noticed by him. He didn't say anything. And by the time the evening was over, things were just boiling over. What started as a minor traffic stop, we were stopped here at the light, the restaurant's right there at the light, and she notices, and before the night is over, in her mind, now of course this is, it is emerging out of a history in which something horrible had happened. But in that moment, right then, they had been working through that history and so forth. But there were other things that were going on for her that day and that week that weren't even about her marriage. Mm-hmm. But this came back into their relationship. And so we can also have, and we'll see later how this happens, relationally, how seemingly minor things can take place. There's a story in Anatomy of the Soul that I tell about Eugene, and he comes home from work, and he walks into the house where his young son and a couple of his friends are playing, and Eugene just kind of like loses his temper with them. And, the kids are like a little startled by all this, and they're just being normal 8-year-old boys. And, he's upset because they're loud and there's stuff all over the house, and because they're just being 8-year-old boys. And he comes into the kitchen where his wife finds him, who's been hearing him, and he met her gaze, and she's like, I don't know what's going on, but whatever's going on with you, we don't want that coming out the way I just heard it come out in the family room. He goes upstairs and changes his clothes, and it's not just a hard day at work. It's something other about his life growing up that has been this minor thing that blows up in his family room, directed at his 8-year-old son, that's got nothing to do with his 8-year-old son, but has a lot to do with what it was like for him to be 8 years old and have a father tell him all kinds of things about getting things cleaned up, and you have to be perfect, and you have to be this, and so forth and so on. And there's just lots of things in Eugene's life where there are small ruptures, where things are not perfect. And he comes in, and now this becomes this thing that blows up, that starts with something minor.
It reminds me, Kurt, that story reminds me, I hope I don't derail us here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So as we record this, this is Advent, and we've got Christmas coming up here pretty soon, and It's a Wonderful Life. One of my favorite, not just Christmas, not just movies around Christmas. Yeah. It's a fabulous, fabulous film. And when Jimmy Stewart's character we know because we've seen everything that's happened, and with the bank and everything, and he's sitting there, and his daughter's playing the piano, and she just keeps playing the same thing over and over again, and then Zazuz comes, and she wants something from him, and he just blows up, right? Just completely blows up, and it really has nothing to do with what's going on in the room. It's everything that he's brought into the room with him that causes this whole thing. And then if you take that even sort of interestingly a deeper level, Jimmy Stewart himself, there were moments within the movie. There's another moment where he's crying in the bar, and it wasn't really written that way, but he had just gotten back from he was a pilot in World War II, and this was the first movie that he did when he got back, and he they look at it now, and he had PTSD when he was shooting that movie, and so that trauma it came out like that. Just kind of just made me think of that as you were telling the story of Eugene.
Yeah. Well, I think for our listeners, I think it's helpful for us to begin to. We're eventually going to get to the role that shame plays in toxic ruptures, but just a little journey into the neurobiology of this. We have talked about this before on other podcast recordings, that our general way of being in the world through our autonomic nervous system is one that we can talk about. And Alan Shore, the neuropsychologist from UCLA, likes to talk about this, that our brain is made up of an accelerator. That's our sympathetic nervous system. And that accelerator, our sympathetic drive system, we often think about as the fight or flight mechanism, which it is, but it is also the part of our neurobiological system that is in go mode. It's like the gas pedal on a car. We want to go. From the time children are born, they're either asleep or they are going. Even if they're like 2 months old and they're just laying there in their crib, they're like doing they're moving, they're in go mode, and we are in go mode. We want to do things, we want to connect, we want to all these things that we're doing. But sometimes that has to be slowed down, and that is what the parasympathetic system is for, and the brake system. We have an accelerator, we have a brake system, and the go mode has our heart rate up, our blood pressure up, our breathing rate up, our eyes are dilated, all these things like go mode. The brake tends to do the opposite. And for children, the brake is not necessarily always something that they themselves can come up with. The parents have to brake them. The 2-year-old who's going to just run out into the street, we have to brake that. We have to say no to certain things. And so sometimes when children are learning how to apply the brake with the help of a parent who says no, we can say no in any number of different ways. We can say no very, very gently, but sometimes we have to say no very quickly. No! Because the situation calls for it. It's urgent. You're about to do something that is really dangerous. And the real question, we have an accelerator, we have a brake. As any standard transmission car driver knows, If you just decelerate a standard transmission engine, if you don't apply the clutch, that engine is going to violently come to a halt.
For sure.
And I love Shore's metaphor of this, because what he describes that what the clutch is a deeply connected interpersonal relationship. So that if I even have to say no to a child harshly, if I quickly move to them and say, "Oh, hey, Daddy needs you. I need you," because he's across the room, and I have to say no because he's about to get too close to the fire or whatever.
Right.
If I'm willing to get up and move toward him, I'm moving toward him to comfort him. It's the clutch. We all know, for our listeners who drive standard transmission cars, sometimes you slam on the brake. But if you follow it with the clutch quickly enough, you don't lose the engine.
Right.
And this is what it means for us to have an attuned relationship with others such that we can set limits. Sometimes we have to do so quickly, urgently. But to the degree that our intention, this gets back to our last conversation about what is the intention of limit setting, Ruptures. And intention isn't just the thought I'm thinking in my head. My intention is displayed fully in my physical presentation of my intention. I sense it in body language. I sense your intention with your facial expression, your tone of voice, your body language. Everything about that is coming to me with a certain intention. And this then enables us to be to set limits in a connected fashion. And this requires the engagement of the prefrontal cortex to have this clutch ready. My autonomic nervous system of my accelerator and my brake, they are on autopilot. They are working. I don't have to make that happen. It will just happen. If I, as an adult, if I step out into the street and I sense a car coming, I will step back because I don't have to think about it. I will step back because my parasympathetic system will pull me to a halt. But our need for a clutch, our need for an interpersonal relationship that engages the prefrontal cortex whenever a limit is being set is crucially important. And so much of these experiences of toxic ruptures take place when the prefrontal cortex is not involved. For Eugene, when he blew up at his son and the kids in his family room, his prefrontal cortex was not working. He was on autopilot. We're not really paying that much attention to it. And this brings us to a really crucial element here. And that has to do with the fact that when my prefrontal cortex is offline, when it's not involved, as our friend Dan Siegel likes to say, when I have flipped my lid, when my prefrontal cortex is not really in the room, and my lower brain functions are now kind of like grabbed the steering wheel of the car, one of the most important elements that now takes place, both relationally, literally between me and my son, me and my friend, whoever, and literally between certain neural network systems and functional domains within my mind, within my brain, my body, my mind, is the experience of isolation. I get cut off from another human being, and I have parts of my mind's function that get cut off from other parts of my mind's function. There is this sense of isolation. And there is a disintegration that takes place. And when this takes place, we move, as we say, we move from scrapes, small case s, to scrapes literally on my hand, to scrapes with people, large case s. That didn't necessarily have to be a scrape. Eugene didn't necessarily have to respond or posture himself toward his son in the way that he did, but he did because his prefrontal cortex was not engaged when he walked into the room. He was not aware of what he was aware of that was taking place. And so these toxic ruptures lead to what we would call persistent states of disintegration. Persistent states. It's a state that, for instance, when we say stop from across the room, that's going to create a certain level of disintegration for the toddler who hears this. They're startled, they're a little upset by your voice and tone and so forth. But if you move across the room, that state of disintegration does not persist. You quickly close the gap, come to their assistance, and you help them respond as they should to this particular threat that you were warning them about. But toxic ruptures amount to persistent states of integration. So we say something to someone, we glance at someone with a glance of contempt, and then we just let it go, and we don't come back. We're not aware that we're even doing it. Or someone looks at us or talks to us with a certain tone, and we just let it go. It's this what feels like a small thing, because it's not that big of a deal. And we just think, oh, we're good, because I can go on and I can keep moving. We don't recognize that often toxic ruptures, things that become large toxic ruptures, begin with small ruptures that really amount to the absence of presence. They amount to like no one coming to close the gap.
You're making me think that, so, if I'm walking across the street and somebody gives me a look of contempt, mm-hmm. I don't really care, right? Mm-hmm. But if Kurt, mm-hmm. who I know, who I love and who mm-hmm. loves me, mm-hmm. gives me that same look, mm-hmm. we have a trauma. Mm-hmm. that we have to figure out, and
right.
So
right.
just I don't know. I'm just makes me think that go.
Yeah, I mean, we might say that even that person who looks at you with contempt in on the street that you don't know, that's not going to land on us in a neutral fashion.
No, but I don't think it's going to hit me as hard as the other.
Right. And I think that the what we can do, though, is that we can say, I mean, you're absolutely right. It won't hit you as hard as it does when it's, it's like the Psalm where we read, and this is not just anybody. This is a person who betrayed me, who ate dinner at my table.
Right.
Which is what I think I hear you getting at.
Exactly.
Right. And so what are we going to do with that? In these persistent states of disintegration, especially with people that we long to have connection with. I mean, you're right. Somebody cuts me off in traffic, somebody whatever. I'm like, okay, I can let that go because I don't imagine seeing them again.
Yeah, and even in that, it does help, like we had talked about in a previous episode, that if the person waves and lets you know that they didn't mean to do it or whatever, it right. does help. It does get so we are being. So that tells me that we are being impacted by that rupture that's happening mm-hmm. even with a stranger. Mm-hmm. But again, I think that that would be more of a micro fracture than
yeah. And I think what's really striking me as we're entering into this. When we began this season back at the Connections Conference, our first episode. Back in October, this was before the election, and the election in summary, the election of 2024 was an occasion that was generating both before the election and certainly after the election, generating a lot of felt sense of rupture.
Yep.
And so much of this, Pep, is a function of what I call the absence of presence. This sense that I have a story in my mind that involves other people, but they are absent from the room. They are not present in the room. I can't have a conversation with them in which I'm going to address the perceived rupture that we have.
Yeah.
We have an entire now economy, a portion of our economy that is based on a social media matrix of platforms that at one level create some sense of greater connection, and for the most part are doing just the opposite.
Yep.
And so we can find great joy in those platforms, but where contempt shows up in those platforms, mm-hmm. it is offered to one another with no sense of having to take responsibility for this, no sense of repair. There's no presence with this.
Right.
And this is why I want to invite our audience to just consider that when we're talking about toxic ruptures, and we're going to get to shame here in just a moment. We're really one of the primary issues here is this question of isolation. This question of like, I'm not present to the person with whom I'm having this toxic rupture that is in my mind. How many of us who are listening, who's had someone do something to us, we feel betrayed, we feel all these kinds of, and they are out of our life.
Yeah.
And so the story just grows in my head, and there's no sense of repair because there's no sense of presence in order to like do something about it.
Right.
And culturally, no matter where one finds oneself in the political spectrum, we are paying so much attention to a story that we are telling that is grounded in the very theme that you read about in the first chapter of The Great Divorce, where when C.S. Lewis paints the picture of hell as being a place where people continue to build their homes further and further and further apart from one another.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is one thing, that this disintegrated state of a toxic rupture is a deep function of isolation. This is where we get to trauma. In season 4 of our podcast, we did a whole season on trauma. And we talk about trauma being a state, first of all, being overwhelmed and then being powerless. These two pillars. I'm overwhelmed and I'm powerless to do anything about the overwhelm. And both of these states, being powerless and being overwhelmed, are functions of isolation. And we notice eventually that shame plays such a crucial role in this isolating process. And we had the season on the book, The Soul of Shame, and we recognize that some features about shame, first of all, are that they are things that it is a neurophysiologic event that leaves me feeling completely isolated. And it is in this isolation that my grief begins to emerge. This toxic rupture that employs shame as its primary neurophysiological weapon. And it basically is saying to you, you don't matter to me. Because even if it happens, I'm not coming back to repair this. And, you know, we tend to think of like toxic ruptures as being big things, and certainly they are. But what if I'm, you know, we've told this story before, the young guy who, you know, as a 10-year-old comes to his dad with the first time he gets a really great grade in math, and he's got the 92%, and he says, Dad, here's my 92%. And Dad says to him, where's the other 8%?
Yeah.
You know, this is not child abuse. This is not an abusive father, but it is a moment of shame that is toxic in its nature. It's toxic in its nature because shame is involved and there's no repair made. Now, the thing is, that 10-year-old boy has the wherewithal to live his life and do really well. And what does he become? He becomes an 18-year-old all-state football player, straight A student, who is like, the world would say like, oh my gosh, like you come from the perfect family, you're doing all the perfect things and so forth and so on. And in his mind, he's telling himself, I am not enough, I am not enough, I am not enough, which is why I make straight A's and I'm going to go play, you know, college football and all the things that I'm going to go do without anyone ever recognizing the multiple number of small toxic ruptures that have taken place that have never been repaired. And so for many of our listeners, we can start to imagine, my goodness, like, I only thought that toxic ruptures happened like when my parents got divorced. But it's like anything else. We get a small cut on our hand. If I have good nutrition, good health care, I get Band-Aids, I get, you know, hydrogen peroxide in my house. Yeah, I can get that. And like, I can clean up and I can be fine. You know, my wife and I had the privilege of being in Africa this past summer, and we spent time at a place called Tenwick, which is a large Christian hospital complex there. I have a good friend, Steve Manchester, who's been a primary care physician there for 20 years. And, you know, Steve is quick to point out that they're doing amazing things. But for every patient that they are able to save, the patient to the right and the left, they lose. And the vast majority of these deaths are preventable deaths. These are people who, if they were living in Cincinnati or in Washington, they would not be dying.
Right.
But so much of it has to do with small things that don't really get tended to soon enough. Mm-hmm. And it leads to catastrophe. And this is how toxic ruptures can take place. And so we look around at our culture even, not just our families, we look at our culture, and isolation is rampant. Yeah. COVID did not help us with this. We become... Yeah.
So I have a friend who is a listener to the podcast. Kurt, how are you? He's a Kurt also.
Oh, yeah.
And he's a recovering crack addict. And we were talking, and he said, and I think he said that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And when COVID was coming up, he does a lot of work helping people that are in addiction. And when COVID was coming up, he was really, when it was happening, it was this isolation that happened. The deaths spiked so high in that community because separation is addiction. I just thought that was a fascinating way to, picture of this really being true in the world.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so, we can have these toxic ruptures that we can all identify quite easily because they feel big, the ones that we can identify, but we don't necessarily identify nearly as quickly these minor events that often just don't go repaired. They never become repaired. And the degree to which our ruptures have been repaired is the key to our grief. It is the key to what toxicity and the kinds of ruptures that toxicity brings are really all about. We can have long-term relational ruptures. And, we think, oh, this happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And because it happened then, it's a thing in the past. My parents divorced when I was 20. So but that was 20 years ago. I don't know why is that still an issue for me? And then, we have this way of sustaining and either changing or deepening the nature of that rupture depending upon how we tell stories about it. That storytelling process that we as human beings enter into, it can extend and grow the rupture. We continue a narrative that holds all other parties responsible for our pain, for example. One of the primary challenges that we have in working with patients who are with trauma is to discern where the space is where we can begin to help them imagine and consider and then begin to address what part of their suffering are they responsible for. And this is challenging because it's very tender. These are very tender things where something real has really happened to folks that we have to take into consideration, we have to address. But we also eventually have to address what has been my response. If I'm the patient, what has been my response to these ruptures? And how have I perhaps told a story that actually continues to strengthen the nature of the ruptures by paying more attention to my grief than I pay attention to those who are coming to comfort me? This is tricky. This is hard work. And that commitment to comfort that places no demand on me to make any changes is not actually ultimately comfort. This is what addiction is ultimately about. I certainly, someone can come to me and I can say, like, look, the reason I'm looking at porn or the reason I'm drinking so much, the reason I'm using opiates is because my life is this. And we can be empathic about their life. And sometimes, and they'll say, yes, I really get that. And I want you to stop drinking. And this is where it's difficult because I have to recognize at some point that my drinking is contributing to my ruptures. It may not be where it started, but I am now a collaborator with this. And this is what repentance is. In some respects, I'm going to repent from the story that I'm telling as part of it. But I can't do this by myself.
Right.
I cannot do this by myself. So, I'm aware right now, even as we're talking about this, as our listeners, they might be going, well, what do you mean, Kurt? Does it mean like when things have happened to us, are we like supposed to say, no, that's not important? Absolutely not. What we're saying is that things can happen to us in which shame is the primary neurophysiologic, primary affective fuel that is really governing the nature of how I'm imagining this relationship. How I'm imagining my relationship with Democrats, with Republicans. How I'm imagining my relationship with people who think differently than I do about sexual ethics. How I'm thinking differently about certain things with other people in my church pews. All these stories that we tell in which I have imagined, I have perhaps ruptures that have taken place, but some of them are ones that I am part of because they've happened in my own mind without me taking seriously the role that I'm playing in the sustenance of that rupture. And in this way, I become someone who's practicing resentment, for example. And in so doing, I remember wounds. By remember, I mean I once again go back and revisit it and put that story together again in the same way. And I reject hope in that same way. This is really tough for us, which is why we need a community of people who can be present to our wounds, who can be hospitable to the parts of us that are suffering. You know, this is what Jesus is doing in healing toxic wounds, toxic ruptures. When we think about the woman in Mark 5 who comes with a bleeding problem, we've talked about her on this podcast before, this notion, here she comes with her evidence, her embodied toxic rupture, in that she has a bleeding problem, but she also, because of it, has become the scapegoat in the community. And Jesus is basically saying, in her healing, now I want you to go and live a different life. But how's she going to do this? When he says to the woman caught in adultery in John 8, where are your accusers? There are none. Yes, correct. There are none. Now, go and sin no more. It would be easy for her to say, but I don't have a job. But how am I going to feed my kids? And he is unapologetic about what he says to her. He now is inviting her to tell a different story about her story, while he is also comforting her and acknowledging what has been done to her. And we live in a culture that makes it really difficult for us to imagine that we can both name our ruptures where they have taken place, and at the same time begin to take responsibility for the parts of the role that we have played in how that has taken place. And so it's true that we may be the victim of a rupture, and we also have to be aware of the elements of that rupture in which we also now become its cause. Or we may have been the cause of other ruptures, where shame has been the primary weapon that we've used, or it has been used against us. And whether these have been large cataclysmic moments, or whether this has been a series of small moments that have all kind of gathered steam over time, these toxic ruptures lead us sometimes to despair, to hopelessness, to resignation. We just leave relationships behind. We assume I want nothing more to do with the church. I want nothing more to do with that group of people who are different than me, that have done the whole range. I don't want anything to do with my parents, with my in-laws, with my this, with my that, because we're trying to protect ourselves. And we are going, and so we just want to acknowledge that this happens to us personally, but it also happens in the context of our minds culturally, where we are so disconnected and isolated from everybody else who's on our internet platforms, telling a very different story about us than we want to be told about ourselves. And we're soon going to make a turn in our series here about what do we do about repairing ruptures. But I want us to recognize that toxic ruptures are a really big deal, and they are often mostly a big deal because of how subtle they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we name that and identify that, the good news about this is that as soon as we begin to name them, We put the lie to the great liar. We put the lie to the accuser. We pull the curtain back on what evil is up to, because for all of our listeners, as hard as toxic ruptures are and how pervasive they are in so much of our culture and our personal lives, we have really good news that's coming.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that brings us to our application for this week. And, what we'd love you to do this week is to, sit for a minute, either turn your phone off or leave it across the room or set it upside down so you don't see it, you don't feel it. And I want you to sit and think about what toxic ruptures that you have experienced that just easily come to your mind. How many of them are large ruptures? And how many of them are quite small, but maybe a part of a collection of unrepaired ruptures? And in what ways are you now aware of how you're contributing to the toxicity of the ruptures that you had experienced or you have experienced? How does your ongoing contribution to the rupture help you? Or in what ways does your maintenance of the rupture protect you from something that you are afraid of? This is going to require you to be real honest with yourself. And it's always a great thing a great help if you can write this down, name it, and then if you can share it with somebody, because we don't do this work alone ever. Yeah. Thanks, Kurt. I'm looking forward to taking the turn towards repair, but I appreciate you going into the this whole idea of toxic ruptures and helping us to see where, even if these things happen to us, we play a role in keeping them alive. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you, my brother.
Yeah. And we're going to be bringing Amy in on YouTube now. So stick around for that. And if you aren't on YouTube, head on over. We'd love to see you.
Right on.
And you can see Kurt's red and blue ensemble. I love you, buddy.
Really?
Really. It's actually burgundy, but we aren't going to go there.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, guys.
Hey, Em.
Hey. Aim.
It is burgundy.
Yes.
What were we going to say? Aim what?
No, it's just I. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I want to say, I'm aware of feeling. I'm just like, okay. I want to get onto the repair part of our episodes because
Sure.
I'm just aware of the felt sense, and I'm just thinking about for our listeners, you're like, oh, okay, thanks, Kurt, for the reminder.
Okay, yeah. Let's get to the next.
Yeah, it's great.
I was thinking the same thing, and then Pep said it. I was like, I'm really looking forward to it's pretty clear. There's rupture.
Yeah.
Now what?
Yeah.
And it strikes me again how critical the curiosity and having a hospitable group of people around us is to this work. Like, see the guy that you mentioned that, comes home and yells at his 8-year-old, and then his wife is like, I'm thinking that's coming from somewhere else. And if it is done in a hospitable way, it gives us our best chance to go change our work clothes and think, I'm going to be curious about that.
Totally. Yeah.
And this idea, so triggers and grudges stood out to me, and the application. These triggers, there's no avoiding them. There are going to be triggers. Whether we're stopped at a stoplight and we notice a restaurant that we're flooded. And so it's the work is not to avoid these things, because that's a lost battle.
And what you said at the beginning, Kurt, the work is also not to kill it, but to master it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you shared with me in a personal setting about when these things come up, being able to regulate them, being able to regulate when, because
as best we can.
As best we can.
Dang moment.
Yeah. But and the point is that they're going to come up. You're probably not going to be able to kill it entirely. I mean, it's yeah.
No. I mean, you could. I just continue to go back to the first 3 chapters of Genesis. There is this sense in which the serpent was a creature that God made.
Right.
Right. It didn't just show up on its own. I mean, it showed up in the garden with its intention on its own, but it didn't just exist on its own. God made this, and there is this sense in which it's a trigger. Right. It comes in. They don't know it's a trigger yet, but they're given one simple task.
Yeah.
Don't eat of this fruit. Don't eat that tree. And it's really tricky. It is really tricky. And I sometimes think that we think that growth and maturity is measured in terms of I never get triggered.
Right.
Maturity.
Hello.
Maturity will be. I will recognize that I'm mature, fully mature, when there is no longer when the snake comes around. I will no longer be afraid of the snake. I will just see the snake and I will this will be great. Mm-hmm. As opposed to maturity actually being a growth in my capacity to better regulate when I am triggered.
Right. Not when, not if.
Oh, yeah, when I am triggered, right. Mm-hmm. And because for me, that's a matter of because even if I don't regulate it well enough, if I don't do it perfectly, even that it contributes to the rupture. Mm-hmm. Because now I'm judging myself for not having, responded to the rupture in the right way, which is just piling on. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, the whole grudge thing. Kurt, when you said, okay, if there's a grudge, if you're holding a grudge, there has been a rupture at some point.
Yeah,
and
totally.
In recovery, in the rooms, much of the work is about what is your part. You say this whole liturgy of stuff, and they're like, what's your part? And it's what, are you kidding me? What is my part? But it's that's where okay, so then a grudge, sometimes I'll say I want to say we, but we're not, I'm not even aware of what the rupture was. Mm-hmm. I just hold on to this grudge, and that could go on forever.
Right.
But then if my part is holding on to it, that is the hope, because then I have to figure out what the grudge is.
Right.
The rupture is, I mean.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think about, so I grew up in this house where we were taught to be, where I was taught to be afraid of being angry. Uh-huh. And I was taught to be wary of anybody who's anxious.
Oh my gosh!
Right, so we're all working really hard. My father, who as we said, right, he's not an angry guy because everybody's working so hard not to piss him off, right? So this is right. Now he truly wasn't, but you just didn't want to be in the room if you could, there's urban legend of Lewis Thompson. You just don't want to mess with him, and at the same time, he's just such a beautiful man. I know this, but but it's also a situation where for all of his giftings and all of his beauty, he and I never had a single substantive conversation. He didn't approach me for anything. There was a lot, neglect would not be the right word. That's too hard a word. But there is a certain sense in which I was missed. There were just certain things that a son needs from his father in particular that I didn't get. And I'm not even aware that there is a rupture that is there. That is not grossly toxic, but it is minorly toxic. There is a rupture that takes place that nobody knows. I don't have some sense that my dad knew exactly what he should be doing and chose not to do it. He didn't know. But I didn't also, as an 8-year-old, as a 15-year-old, I wasn't aware that, except that one story I think I've told here before where my mom comes to me and says, well, your dad came to me and wanted to know why it is that you will talk to me about certain things but won't talk to him. And I remember even as a 15-year-old looking at her and saying, do you hear what you're asking? Do you see what's going on here? And she acknowledged that, and nothing ever came of it. Like, there was no conversation between my dad and me about any of these things. And I kind of went on and didn't really think about this. And it wasn't until later in life, literally until just a few years ago, when the last of my 3 brothers who died from cancer passed away, and I'm the only remaining member of my family of origin. And I remember, I may have said this here too before, I remember saying to Phyllis, I became aware within a few weeks, I just became a gathering storm of rage.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, where is this coming from? And, as I came to say, oh, so it turns out there are certain conversations that you can't really have until certain people are dead. Mm-hmm. But you don't know that? You don't know it until, the river just, it comes at flood stage in an hour. This is what will happen with rivers, right? They're just, you gradually see them and then boom, they're just and now they're 6 feet over their banks. And I'm like, oh my gosh. It's a collection of toxic ruptures that were very, very subtle and minor by virtue of things not being said in my family. People are feeling it, people are sensing it, and people are doing all kinds of things to pretend things aren't happening. Nobody would look at my family and think, oh my gosh, there is a cauldron of toxicity in that Thompson family. No one would think this.
Right.
And yet we had our own particular little pot of Giardia growing. Yeah, here, drink this.
Oof.
And, nobody was dying. No, it wasn't killing people. But we were not well.
Yeah.
And so for many of our listeners, I think this is what it's like. If I can't look around and see dead bodies everywhere and see if it's not a war, if I'm not living in Ukraine, then it's not. You can't be that bad,
right?
And we would want to say, actually, this is part of the lie that evil perpetrates, which is this sense that, if I'm not missing a limb, then I must be healthy.
Right. It's like being pecked to death. It's like you get pecked once. It's like, oh, it's no big deal.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's a big deal.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I'm also just really I just feel acutely like we're in this season where in our moment
culturally
there's just lots of conversation about the othering. And the divide between, we kind of call it this. Oh yes, the nation is so divided. Like who are we talking about? Can you name names? And if you can think of a name with whom you are divided, like a person within that could be within arm's reach, then go have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, rather we I know I'm too busy. I'm on my phone.
Just this general.
Yeah, I'm abstracting everything. And we're going to get to this when we eventually talk about repair, this notion that in the same way that isolation and disembodiment is such a crucial, repeated element of rupture that is toxic, so will embodiment be a crucial element of repair. I mean, this is what the serpent does in the Garden of Eden, right? He wants to talk about God from a distance. He doesn't want to talk with God when God comes along later in the afternoon to have his daily walk. And we end up doing the same thing. I have a rupture, and instead of going and talking with that person, I want to talk about them with other people who will kind of, maybe help me provide empathy for me, but also may just help me continue to tell the story the way I want to.
Yeah. And the idea of telling a different story about our story is...
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
And the application made me super excited about getting to I think it's the next episode on repair.
We're hoping.
I'm hoping.
Dear gracious.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's like thinking about ruptures that happened a long time ago where maybe we're not in relationship with the people. It's like,
Yeah.
what do we do with that?
Yeah, yeah. And I want to highlight for our listeners here too, just to make sure that I'm clear about this, because I mentioned quite a bit this notion of what part of the story are we contributing.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
My capacity to tell a different story can't happen until I've had the experience of feeling felt.
Mm-hmm.
In order for me, even in recovery rooms, Aim, right, there is this sense in which, to answer that question, and what role did you play? What's your part?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I can't get to that if I have not yet first felt some sense of empathic connection regarding the part of my story where I truly have been wounded.
Right.
Where I have been run over in the crosswalk. If I'm the pedestrian who stepped into the street, I stepped in the street, I got run over by a drunk driver in a blackout. I can't start to work on being more careful until I get my fractured femur taken care of.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so I want us to know that this is a rhythmic dance that we're involved in. That your story matters, and where the ruptures have happened to you, it matters that those stories be heard, and that you have that you have the sense of being hospitably received. Mm-hmm. In order for us all to then begin to be curious, what can I begin to do about repair?
Yeah.
What repairs are possible? What repairs may not be, because of things that I have nothing to do with, because other people aren't able to be part of that repair work. Right. We'll get to some of those questions and reflections as we go forward.
Great.
Which is soon.
Soon.
Yeah.
Soon and very
Right
soon.
on. Right on.
All right. Thanks, you two.
It was great, guys.
All right, everybody. Next time.
Next time.
Love you. All right.
Love you.
guys.
This podcast is produced by Kurt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at BeingKnownPod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.